Σας. Good evening. Καλό μήνα. And before I introduce to our lectures this evening, I would like to welcome. We have two new members to the ARU today who have just signed their contracts as postdocs, Anna Georgiadou and Yorgos Papandoniou. We're very happy to have them on board. So, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it is really a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture by Professor Bernard Knapp and Nathan Meyer. And before giving them the floor, I would like to say a few words for each of our speakers. Bernard Knapp, of course, needs absolutely no introduction. Everybody knows him very well, and having moved to Cyprus in the last few years, he's not only known from his publications, but he's a constant presence both here and at CARI. In fact, he's also a member of the ARU Advisory Board. Bernard received his PhD from the University of Berkeley in 1979, and the title of his dissertation was A Re-Examination of the Interpretation of Cypriot Material Culture in the Middle Cypriot III to Late Cypriot I period in the light of textual data. In other words, it will soon be 40 years that Bernard is active, well, more, but in Cypriot archaeology. And he has much to show for this time in terms of publications and research projects. He has been a research fellow at the University of Berkeley, the University of Sydney, the University of Cambridge, and then took an academic position at Macquarie University in Australia until 1996, when he took up the position of reader and then professor in Mediterranean archaeology at the University of Glasgow, where he stayed until his retirement in 2007. He currently holds the position of Professor Emeritus at the University of Glasgow and is an honorary research fellow at the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute. Throughout his career, Bernard has been a prolific writer, publishing widely papers and reviews in scientific journals, conference proceedings, and collective works, and books, which he seems to be bringing out on a yearly basis. The latest one you can see outside in our new books collection. He has published or edited no less than 25 books. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's plus or minus a couple. Many of which figure as references in all scholarly work that is published on the prehistory of Cyprus and the Mediterranean. While at Macquarie University, Bernard decided it was time to actually do some fieldwork, but of course in his own terms, and bringing new technologies and a solid theoretical basis. He thus set up the Sydney Cyprus Survey Project, which was one of the first field projects to apply geographic information systems and databases in the recording of a region which at the time was archaeologically terra incognita. It is during SCISEP that our close collaboration started, as I was asked to join his research team in order to record and study the archaeometallurgical sites in the area. It was also during SCISEP that his collaboration with Nathan Meyer began. Nathan was already active in archaeology in the 1980s and 1990s, working first in Italy, in Bulgaria, and Greece before starting work in Cyprus. He joined the Sydney Cyprus Survey Project, for which he designed and managed the database and GIS systems. He was the computer wizard of the project, thanks to whom SCISEP became so well known. And I think it was the first really, and that's why it has become a reference project because for all this work that has been done in at the time, new technologies. Now it's unthinkable to do surveys without GIS and databases. After getting master's degrees from both Bryn Mawr College and University of California at Berkeley, Nathan left archaeology to pursue a work as an information technology professional. In 1917, he retired for that line of work, having finished his career as a vice president for strategic planning. Nathan was readmitted to UC Berkeley in the spring of 2018 and has returned to Cyprus after 20 years to pursue his interest in early Iron Age. In his proposed dissertation, he will be attempting to improve the quality of regional survey ceramic data by pursuing a program of microscopic, and chemical analysis of coarse and otherwise undiagnostic planewares. So Bernard and Nathan joined forces again after many years, and this evening they will be delivering a joint lecture entitled Bronze Age Demise, Iron Age Regeneration on Cyprus. So welcome back to the podium, Bernard. Welcome back to Cypriot Archaeology, Nathan, and we all look forward to listening to your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. I'm going to leave you a moment for you to read the two quotations on the screen, which may give you some idea why we're standing here tonight. I also want to add a brief bit of background to this talk, which has emerged out of a paper that Nathan and I recently wrote. I was invited to make a contribution to a volume on collapse at the end of the Aegean Bronze Age, and decided that I would do so by trying to look at the aftermath of collapse, i.e., the early Iron Age on Cyprus. I soon ran up against my limitations when I began to read extensively on the early Iron Age, not least because of the deluge of publications that have appeared over the past 2 decades, not in large part, I should say, produced by scholars working in this archaeological research unit. Fortunately and fortuitously, Nathan had just decided to return to archaeology and to undertake a PhD on the early Iron Age in Cyprus. So I invited him to take part, and it's fair to say that without his collaboration, that article would never have been written in the way it was, and nor would we be standing in front of you tonight presenting this paper. I owe a great debt to Nathan on that score. So, the concept of collapse has propelled a great deal of world archaeological research on prehistoric as well as historic societies. Not least amongst this research are several volumes treating the decline of various polities in the late Bronze Age Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, within a half-century either side of 1200 BC. As a polity that may have withstood at least some of the destabilizing conditions that affected the surrounding regions, Cyprus offers an opportunity to reassess the transformations that occurred at this time and to consider various strategies that characterize the island's resilience, ultimately leading to the reconstitution of its politico-economic regimes. And here I want to state our basic premise. While we accept that the Iron Age is, in many respects, the product of the Bronze Age, we regard these periods and the cultures that represent them as distinct. The Bronze Age may inform the Iron Age, but it does not define it. The political and economic regimes of the Bronze Age disappeared, and Cypriot society evolved in other ways to participate in new Iron Age social and politico-economic realities. Among the more contentious issues concerning early Iron Age Cyprus are the nature of the island's late Bronze and early Iron Age polities, as well as the time when the new Iron Age political formations emerged and coalesced. Iacovu has argued persuasively that the process leading to the formation of the Cypro-archaic polities must have begun no later than the 12th century BC. But the details of that process remain vague, particularly in the absence of settlement data and the resulting reliance on an array of other types of evidence. The paucity of settlement evidence on Cyprus during the centuries between about 1100 and 800 BC has led to two opposing interpretations of the island's early Iron Age polities and the time they emerged. First is that there was a consolidation around 750 BC of earlier political formations as a result of transformations that took place during and after the 12th century BC. And secondly, that entirely new socio-political formations emerged from the 9th to 8th centuries BC onwards. Analyses of such material and documentary evidence as exists have inspired suggestions that you see here on the screen about the nature of these polities and the form of their leadership during the 11th and 10th centuries BC. Such characterizations gloss over crucial questions about the makeup of the political economy and the spatial dimension of power, as well as the kind of territory, agricultural land, metallurgical deposits, forests, coastal resources that any polity may have control. Despite the virtual lack of settlement evidence, there is no shortage of ideas about the politico-economic organization of Cyprus's early Iron Age polities. Foremost amongst them is the so-called Cyprocentric view that envisions a general continuity between what are seen as the heterarchical socio-political structures of the island's late Bronze Age polities and those of the early Iron Age. Papantonio and Kyriakou expressed this viewpoint succinctly in a recent publication, and that quote is now on the screen. Inevitably, such beliefs lead to the view that the Iron Age polities assumed their earliest form by the 11th century BC, even if they were only consolidated some 300 years later. Iacovu suggests that this continuity in political form is mainly predicated on two facts. First, that copper production was the fundamental driver of the Cypriot political economy, and second, that, quote, non-variable coordinates of the island's geography and geology, end quote, with Cypriot copper ores laid out as they are in a great circle around the interior of the island, ensured an enduring regionalism. We tend to agree with her regarding the meaning and impact of these non-variable coordinates and return to discuss them below. Most counterviews variously maintain that the politico-economic organization of late Bronze Age Cyprus, whether heterarchical or centralized, disappeared after the 12th century BC, and that hierarchical regional polities only reappeared on the island during or after the late 9th century BC. We have a somewhat different interpretation, one crucial point of which is that the material and documentary evidence of late Bronze Age Cyprus does not reflect a system of hierarchical or regional polities, but rather points to centralized control by an internationally recognized king. In other words, a state. In our view, a state has two key attributes. First, an internally specialized administrative structure exerting top-down power, and second, direct and, if necessary, coercive control over an extensive territory that underwrites the political economy. This formidable late Bronze Age polity, or state, had the economic, political, and ideological means to organize the production and distribution of copper on an extensive scale. Following its demise, we argue that Cyprus entered a long period from the mid-11th to the mid-9th centuries BC, during which state-level organization is no longer apparent. It only re-emerged in the form of the Cypriot city-states during the 8th century BC, under generally increasing commercial and likely political pressure, but at the same time taking region-specific paths. Our thesis then, broadly stated, is that beyond the enduring geological and geographical realities, there is a substantial discontinuity between the Late Bronze and Early Iron Age. Focusing on continuity runs the risk of denying the Iron Age its historical specificity and possibly missing its unique character. With that in mind, I want to turn the podium over to Nathan to discuss some of the lines of evidence that he has been considering.
Thank you, Bernard. Before I start, just a word of thanks to the Cypriot archaeological community, especially the folks at CARI who have been very kind to me on my return after 20 years, and also the folks at the ARU who have given me time and courtesy on my return. I appreciate it very much. So let's start with the political economy. Yakovu suggests that Cypriot polities had an inherent frailty, partly the result of environmental considerations, but equally due to a reliance on external trade. As we are fully in accord with this suggestion, we propose to consider the nature of Cyprus's early Iron Age polities through the analysis of the evidence for the political economy, namely that portion of the overall economic structure that lies beyond subsistence needs of the household. Our focus, therefore, has to fall upon issues such as large-scale agricultural production and surplus storage, industrial-scale mineral resource extraction and craft production, and finally, the volume and types of trade, both local and more distant. Additionally, we need to look at how surplus and portable wealth of the economy was controlled and redistributed, how society became stratified as a result of that control, and what means were used to maintain this stratification. To pursue these lines of evidence, in what follows, we consider the settlement data, mortuary evidence, pottery production, and the role of rural sanctuaries in a preliminary and exploratory manner, and I want to emphasize that, preliminary and exploratory, intended here to encourage further dialogue and research. Although we suggest that the political economy of Cyprus diminished substantially during the transition from the Late Bronze Age to the Early Iron Age, and only began to expand again towards the end of the Cypro-geometric, we acknowledge that such a general picture is significantly complicated by the island's regional histories, and will only become less so through further study and publication of existing data and the emergence of new relevant data. So let's start with settlement data. Because settlement patterns provide a window through which we may view both the political organization and the economic strategies of any given society, such patterns offer a crucial form of evidence. Several of the main towns of Cyprus were abandoned or destroyed towards the end of the Late Bronze Age. These include coastal or near coastal centers, as well as inland settlements, cemeteries, and production sites. With respect to the island's political economy, it is worth stressing that some sites with significant industrial or agricultural storage capacity, for example, Ios Dimitrios, Moroni Vornes, and Paliotaverna, were abandoned. 3 towns survived these abandonments or destructions and emerged as prominent centers during the 12th century BC, Enkomi in the east, Kidion in the southeast, and Paleipaphos in the southwest. By circa 1100 BC, however, the settlement pattern that had characterized the Late Bronze Age is no longer apparent. The new Iron Age centers arose on sites with diverse types of strategic, economic, or locational advantage. The presence of inland peer polities complicates any understanding of an enduring regional economic model based on political integration of a territory with 3 components of port, agricultural land, and control of copper ores. What we see instead in the early Iron Age is a pattern that indicates less political integration, namely independent polities likely engaged in peer-to-peer trade, presumably copper and agricultural products from the interior in exchange for imported goods from the ports. The figure on the screen provides a snapshot of the current settlement evidence on Cyprus from the 13th through the 7th centuries BC. From this, it is immediately apparent that the new towns, which ultimately became the centers of Cyprus's Iron Age polities, were not fully established until the 9th century BC or later, while nearly all the Late Bronze Age settlements had been abandoned or destroyed well before these new centers emerged. Excepting Kidion and Paleipaphos, possibly Idalion, none of the other Iron Age centers existed on Bronze Age Cyprus. In what Yakovu once termed this urban list environment of the 11th century BC, the topography and the social geography of the Bronze Age settlements seems to have faded from memory. Thus, the dominant impression one gets is that the Cypriot social landscape was substantially reconfigured over the course of 3 centuries. Mortuary evidence. Scholars discussing the Iron Age mortuary practices typically emphasize the change to extramural burials during the 11th century BC, late Cypriot 3b. Instead, we turn to some key points Keswani made in her seminal 2004 book about mortuary practices at the outset of the late Cypriot period. Beyond intramural burials that characterized the new urban environment, extramural burial practices continued during the late Cypriot period at several rural sites. Thus, the key factor differentiating between extramural and intramural burial practices is the urban environment, not the time period. Within the urban environment, burial practices are not uniform. There was also an overall decline in the levels of energy expended on mortuary behavior as the late Cypriot period proceeded. Thus, the changes in late Cypriot mortuary practices were very much tied to the developments driven by the growth of the political economy and state-level complexity, most visibly at play in the urban centers. The ultimate breakdown of the traditional community-focused practices, the rise of competitive claims to the means of production, the overall decline in the social importance of burials, all point to a profound reorganization of society at the end of the late Bronze Age. A subsequent shrinkage in the political economy and the demise of state-level complexity might therefore be expected to drive another change in burial practices. We thus suggest that the return to extramural burials, emphasizing the often newly established local community in the early Iron Age, may signal a return to a diminished political economy, a less complex socio-political organization, and possibly the dissolution of an integrated settlement hierarchy. But does the Iron Age mortuary evidence support such an interpretation? There are two PhD theses in one lengthy article that attempt to examine Iron Age mortuary practices island-wide. Their key findings may be summarized as follows. Rupp found that overall counts and classes of burial goods declined from Cyprogeometric 1 through Cyprogeometric 2. Thank you, sir. And rose again only in the transition to the Cypro-Archaic. He discerned a similar pattern in levels of social stratification. So I'm going to repeat that without Bernard's interruption. Rupp found that overall counts and classes of burial goods declined from the Cyprogeometric 1 through the Cyprogeometric 2, and rose again only at the transition to the Cypro-Archaic. He discerned a similar pattern in levels of social stratification. Steele found that 20% of the graves she examined could be deemed elite. Her analysis suggested a two-tiered social hierarchy, with the elite defining their social position in community burial grounds through competitive displays of wealth. Janes, in her dissertation, took an explicitly regional approach, which I think was an improvement, and found significant differences in mortuary behavior among the three major sites she considered, Paleipaphos, Salamis, and Amathus. The evidence points to site-specific dynamics and differing regional legacies from the late Cypriot period onward. But at all three sites, she sees the Cyprogeometric 3 to Cypro-Archaic 1 transition as an era of more intense social stratification. My recent read of the publications of Karagiouris and Raptu on the necropolis at Paleipaphos do not seem to violate this general pattern, although the abundance of metal goods at Plakes and Skales is striking, and at Skales, the increasing evidence of cremations is also striking. In her recent publication of the Upper Geometric Cemetery at Lapithos, Diakou notes a similar pattern of social reconfiguration in the Cyprogeometric. Although there were few, if any, changes to mortuary behavior in Cyprogeometric 2, by Cyprogeometric 3, she notes that social stratification appears to, in quotes, harden, as access to disposable wealth was restricted within the community. After the events of the late Bronze Age, there could be no simple return to the earlier mortuary practices. Social forces, as well as the structures and processes of the political economy within Cyprus, had changed, and society had to adjust and reconfigure itself accordingly. While acknowledging the need for much more detailed analysis, we suggest that the mortuary evidence reveals a combination of just such a social reconfiguration in the late Cypriot 3b, Cyprogeometric 1, followed by an overall lessening of disposable wealth in CG2, in turns followed by a resurgence at the transition from Cyprogeometric 3 to Cypro-Archaic. As the current picture from Amathus shows, however, this pattern does not necessarily hold island-wide. Future research thus should focus on these regional trajectories and what nonetheless may be a consistent overall pattern. pottery manufacture and trade. Generally speaking, changes in pottery production often correlate with changes in political economy. For example, the use of the fast wheel is often taken to coincide with specialization and industrialization. According to Georgiou, the earliest attempts to industrialize ceramic production is characterized by a profusion of regional variations at the end of the 13th and into the 12th century. This was a transitional time of technical experimentation with the fast wheel and the amalgamation of foreign and local influences. Neutron activation analyses by Mountjoy and Mumson indicate that Cypriot produced Aegean-style wares at this time were traded across the island, especially those from Enkrimi and Paleipaphos, and extensively off-island, especially those from Paleipaphos and the Holosaltenteki and Kidian region. Sherritt argued that this transition indicated Cyprus was well on the way towards the mercantile economic structures of the Iron Age, and that the industrialized production of pottery would have been a significant source of wealth for a diversified elite. Others have noted the integration, standardization, and quality control of pottery produced during the later 12th century. During the 11th century, this finds expression in the island-wide appearance of proto-white painted ware, the result of what Iacovo terms industrialized fast wheel pottery production. Among 5 key wares, proto-white painted, bichrome, I missed 2 slides, didn't I, Bernard? Proto-white painted, bichrome, black slip, plain white, and courseware, Steele argues for similar forms, standard decorative motifs, a standard fast wheel technology, and a fairly consistent rate of deposition in tombs, although again I note the distinction with amethyst. Such changes spread rapidly across the island, the sign of a highly standardized ceramic culture. Across the late Cypriot 3A and 3B periods, ceramic exports to the Levant drop off precipitously. Gilboa et al. Note a lack of clear evidence for late Cypriot 3A and add that for the late Cypriot 3B to CG1 transition, and I quote here, no Cypriot pottery was shipped to the Carmel coast other than a few pithoi, a situation largely echoed farther north in the Levant. A similar pattern seems apparent in Cilicia, where Lehman sees only a few possible LC3 pottery imports. If pottery production formed a significant component of the late Cypriot 3 economy, it must have been for local and intra-island markets. When exports appear again in the Cypro-geometric, they seem to be serving a much narrower export market and take on the character of what Gilboa et al. Have termed, in quotes, personal exchange versus a commercial venture. Regional variations in pottery styles reappear in the Cypro-geometric. Georgiou has built regional typologies for this period, treating not only questions of style, but also examining 3 ceramic indices, technological, morphological, and decorative. Based on these, she has identified the cultural and territorial dimensions of regional centers and considered the degree to which these various centers influenced each other. She suggests that the resulting typological relations can be read in terms of a regional hierarchy. Summing up then, there appears to be evidence to support the idea of workshop-based industrialized pottery production developing at least by the 13th century BC and accelerating during the 12th century, thereby creating a new substantial component within the political economy at the close of the Late Bronze Age. During the 11th century BC, the ceramic industry appears to have been broadly standardized, but unlike the preceding and following periods, little pottery was exported. This must imply a significantly diminished political economy. The regionalism of pottery styles reappears during the Cypro-geometric period. The possibility that regional ceramic typologies may contribute to an understanding of the development of regional polities, specifically their timing, is of special interest but remains to be demonstrated more clearly. And here I should add I didn't have access to Anna's dissertation, so when I get that I'll possibly change that point of view. Another key question that has crucial implications for the Cypriot economy but requires further investigation is whether the lack of exports in the 11th century BC, followed by a new mode of export beginning in the Cypro-geometric, indicates not only a significantly diminished political economy, but also a new social role for trade, at least for parts of the island. Now we'll look at rural sanctuaries. Renfrew and Cherry's peer polity interaction model charts in part what we believe is a fundamental process of early state formation, namely the negotiation of territorial boundaries in contested space. Thus, we agree with Papantonio when he states, and I quote here, "It is therefore impossible to separate development of urban centers from the overall process of the organization of territory. With respect to rural sanctuaries, we must consider whether their presence in Cyprus's Iron Age landscape represents a symbol of existing authority, or whether they are rather constitutive of that authority. Of course, they may represent both, as political authority is not simply created, but must be maintained or recreated over time." Papantonio has noted the lack of material evidence for early Iron Age rural sanctuaries. They appear mainly in the Cypriot 3G, and then proliferate in the Cypriot Archaic period. Thank you, sir. With the spread of rural sanctuaries at that time, are we seeing the initial constitution of territorial states or their consolidation and maintenance? In light of the mortuary and pottery evidence just discussed, it would seem that political power during the Cypro-geometric period was a regional phenomenon, but the territorial extent of the polities involved is unclear. It stands to reason, at least my reason, that we need to assert authority over that the need to assert authority over space would intensify only in reaction to renewed competition for resources, copper being the obvious example. Can we see any signs of this in the competition in the rural sanctuaries? Again, Papantonio urges us to consider that much of the Cypriot landscape operated as liminal zones. Rather than simply serving as boundary markers then, rural sanctuaries should also be considered path markers, connecting and bringing together various peoples to negotiate cultural and economic forms. He cautions that regional styles should be associated with, and again quoting here, material availability, technological consideration, and workshop spheres of influence rather than with political or national entities. Papantonio and Borogiannis have now suggested that some sanctuaries may have acted as central places, mediating political relationships across the island. Perhaps then it is only in highly contested geographies, such as the Mesorea Plain, where the boundaries of significant city kingdoms would have been located and where sanctuaries served as indicators of attempts to establish firm territorial control. In our view, this would have taken place at the late Cypro-geometric 3, Cypro-archaic 1 transition and was likely the result of the re-emerging production of copper for export. Fourier sees in the Archaic period a territorialization process, one that led from, and I'm quoting here, one that led from fluid boundaries to the political, economic, and cultural organization of the countryside and its control by a centralized authority. She notes that rural sanctuaries and various social practices associated with them, and I quote again, prompted the crystallization of cultural identities, which in turn helped shape the identity of the community. She then suggests that other lines of evidence, pottery production, proliferation of secondary sites, signs of royal authority, would seem to point to a late, i.e. Cypro-archaic, crystallization of community, identity. Despite this seemingly convincing portrayal of state development and territorial expansion during the Cypro-geometric 3, Cypro-archaic 1 horizon, Fourier adds that Cypriot Iron Age centers either endured from the late Bronze Age or were founded in the 11th century BC. She then concludes that this represents the consolidation of existing Cypriot kingdoms rather than the formulation of a new political entity. And here we come back full circle to the indeterminate nature of the settlement pattern evidence. We certainly cannot say that we understand the nature of settlement during the 11th century BC, and thus arguing about foundation dates seems to be a moot point. Even if we accept that population centers established in the 11th century went on to become stable urban forms, presumably with stable socio-political framework, the lines of evidence we have presented here suggest a substantial reconfiguration of Cypriot society during the early Iron Age. We suggest then that the polities involved only achieved a state level of social stratification and complexity toward the end of the Cypro-geometric period. And Bernard, it's back to you, sir.
Sorry. Because the material culture of Cyprus always differs notably from that of the surrounding lands, Cypriot prehistory and protohistory must always be viewed from an internal perspective. In this respect, our argument must be deemed Cyprocentric. We would add, however, that we can only understand internal developments on the island within the wider context of the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. Thus, it is instructive to consider very briefly the aftermath of decline in the surrounding regions. In her recent study of the post-Mycenaean economy, Sarah Murray maintains that there were deep and broad changes in social and political realities. Large late Bronze Age settlements with significant levels of population and extensive monumental architecture were replaced by impoverished sites with few notable monuments. This should sound familiar to a Cypriot audience. Population declined by as much as 50%, and life became a fight for survival, as she says, even as new institutions emerged that would eventually form the building blocks of historical Greece. The shrinking of the Mycenaean political economy led to other major structural changes in the organization of society. The new socio-political order that arose during the 8th century BC seems indicative of a newly emerging complex society, not the reconstruction of an earlier predecessor. In sum, it appears that economic decline in the Aegean set in motion a long, drawn-out process of crisis and recovery, one that eventually resulted in an entirely new socio-political order, the polis. Despite the enduring truth of the non-variable components of Cyprus's political geography, we would suggest that in the context of the Iron Age Eastern Mediterranean, the city-states of Cyprus, like the Greek polis, had little relationship to their late Bronze Age counterparts. Turning to the Levant, a series of destructions or abandonments mark the final Bronze Age levels of several coastal or near-coastal states in the north. Farther south, several coastal Lebanese sites have no destruction levels dated around 1200 BC, while evidence from others is more equivocal or non-extant for the late Bronze Age. In the southernmost Levant, however, several sites show a series of destruction levels, some less dramatic than others, dated around 1200 BC. Other sites, like Dur, seem to be marked more by continuity than by change. The task of characterizing political-economic transformations in early Iron Age sites along the Levantine coastal corridor is far from straightforward. Nonetheless, in the wake of the late Bronze Age destructions and abandonments, it is clear that several small or mid-sized polities emerged anew, typically seen to reflect unique developments in Iron Age state formation. In some, communities all along this coast underwent transformation as regional states declined or collapsed, resource acquisition strategies broke down, and populations shifted. New relations of power had to be established and legitimized within specific spatial and historical context. Routledge regards Levantine Iron Age state formation as a process of bricolage, not the unfolding of some pre-existing socio-historical or politico-economic process. In sum, new polity formations seem to have unfolded in both the early Iron Age Aegean and the Levant, as well as in Anatolia, which is not discussed here for the lack of time. Thus, we might reconsider the extent to which Cyprus was able to maintain any level of politico-economic organization across the late Bronze Age, Iron Age divide, in the face of the changing geopolitical realities of the early Iron Age. The dramatic changes evident in the island's settlement evidence and the fall-off in the production and distribution of copper demonstrate that Cyprus's urban population abandoned its main towns, and that its ruler or rulers no longer commanded the level of socioeconomic organization necessary to sustain one of its most important export-based industries. To summarize and conclude then, the striking changes seen in the settlement evidence strongly suggest that the island's urban population plummeted, having abandoned the main towns as a result of cascading social, environmental, or economic stresses that are still poorly known. Moreover, there is still only circumstantial evidence for the claim of continuous copper production on Cyprus during the 11th and 10th centuries BC. Despite regional differences, the mortuary data seem to indicate that the levels of social stratification evident in the late Bronze Age fell off during the Cyprogeometric, with signs of a newly emergent stratified society only apparent at the Cyprogeometric III Cyproarchaic transition. Pottery production reached regional industrialization levels in late Cypriot III, in late Cypriot IIIa, became more simplified in late Cypriot IIIb, but may have lost commercial importance in the Cyprogeometric. And finally, the evidence from rural sanctuaries suggests that the territory beyond the immediate population centers may have been uncontested until late in the Cyprogeometric, and only became highly politicized in the Cyproarchaic. In our view, it is difficult to tease much more out of the published archaeological record. We would suggest, nonetheless, that if the accumulation of wealth was based to any significant degree on the extraction, production, and trade in copper, then territorial control, that is, spatial power, would have been essential. We would suggest that the establishment of territorial boundaries in Cyprogeometric III likely does not represent the consolidation of pre-existing kingdoms, but rather territorial extensions coinciding with the re-emergence of state-level complexity, the impetus being a resurgence in copper production. Like most other topics discussed tonight, this too requires entirely separate, much more intensive study and analysis. So, despite nearly 2 decades of focused research on such evidence as we have for the early Iron Age, there is still little agreement on just when the well-established Cyproarchaic city-states first coalesced as such. While the founding date of Cyprus's early Iron Age polities will continue to be of historical interest, regional trajectories seem to preclude the likelihood of establishing any single event or a series of events driving a foundation horizon. In any case, such dates are of interest mainly for setting the broader geopolitical and environmental context within which Cypriot society was reconfigured. Nonetheless, we now feel we can suggest that although Cyprus may have weathered some of the more disastrous effects of the widespread and long-term collapse during the 12th century BC, ultimately it succumbed to the changing, more competitive, smaller scale politico-economic realities of the 11th and 10th centuries, not least concerning the demise of the highly specialized exchange systems that revolved in part around the production and distribution of Cypriot copper. There followed a period in which we can assume that several smaller, local, or regional polities emerged on the island, but their political structure and social organization remain issues for further research and analysis, including new field discoveries, as is ever the case in archaeology the world around. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the club. It's wonderful to have new associates working into the difficulties of the early Iron Age. It's very impressive.
Thank you.
We have a lot to discuss. I'm sure it's not going to be the end this evening. It's only the beginning.
Oh yeah, for sure, yes.
So let's see what our audience has to say. You have silenced them all.
Bludgeoned into silence.
Sorry, it's circumstantial, and I'll tell you why it's circumstantial. The 4 radiocarbon dated samples from Agroquipia criades place mining operations in the Cypro-geometric period, and you say provide solid evidence for the continuation of the copper industry in the Iron Age. In fact, the date range of these samples extends from the late 10th to the 5th century BC, and so provides only circumstantial evidence. These are radiocarbon dates that are plus and minus 400 to 500 years, have absolutely nothing to do with establishing strong, uncircumstantial evidence. And so all the other evidence that you've cited, I think in your 2014 paper for David's Festschrift. No, this was a 2014 paper. I think you wrote one similar for Frankel's Festschrift, in which you discuss mining timbers, ropes, slag heaps, and so on. And we find this evidence at the moment inconclusive or of a later date, 9th and 8th centuries BC. And the only other evidence that I know of is the lead isotope analysis of a single plano-convex ingot from Hatzor in the southern Levant, which indicates it's consistent with production from Cypriot ores, but it too dates to the 9th century BC. So I insist this evidence is circumstantial for the early Iron Age.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I'd like to have 2 comments or questions. One is, you referred several times to the term political economy, so I would like to know from which least modern sources you draw this from anthropological point of view or ancient history point of view. And the second question is, if we live from continuity or not continuity in topography, and then we see the actual iconography and the material evidence, I think, as I argued several times, that we see a strong continuity in terms of symbol in ideology from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age. How do you perceive this? How do you see this?
Honestly, I haven't looked at that
Nathan?
material. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. I haven't looked at that material yet, quite honestly, so I can't answer your second question, but I promise I will, if I can make the time to read all that. It's very dense. But I'm aware of the work, and I know I need to look at it. In terms of the first question, so I mean, I would offer more comments from you if you'd like to comment on that for the audience at all. But otherwise, I'll just answer the first question on political economy. You know, it's primarily from an anthropological point of view, and I think really what Bernard and I are together as we think about this problem together. What we're thinking our way through is what kind of leverage can we get on this problem space? Because obviously, a lot of people, smart people, have been looking at it, working on it. We're just 2 more individuals coming and looking at it, and we're trying to think about how can we get some more leverage. And we chose that political economy lens as a way of talking about how society, and particularly how the role of certain social actors may have either just been completely obliterated at the end of the late Bronze Age or been very heavily modified, and their involvement in a political economy.
But do you define it in a specific way, the political economy, like Adam Smith, for example, or it's like Timothy Eyre in more anthropological terms, and then how chieftains work and the presence between the chiefs? How do you define it?
Yeah, it's more the latter, although we're not going to get heavily into sort of an evolutionary dialogue about political forms. That's not really the kind of conversation we want to have, but it is really more about that type of conversation. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Thank you very much. You did mention sanctuaries and settlements and pottery. You mentioned copper production, but you didn't mention metal objects at all.
Oh boy, I know that was going to come. Yeah. So 2 comments on that. One is in Maria's office. I think that was maybe the first conversation I had with anybody from the ARU. She mentioned that you have to look at the metal objects, and I totally agree. I mean, it's a big gap right now in the literature.
Specialized craftsmanship.
Yeah, exactly. And
what do you do with it?
yeah, exactly.
Where are you gonna
And
hide
who are those people, and what is their role in the political economy? So I'm with you. I haven't gotten there yet, but in terms of the role that would have in copper extraction, this is a point that Bernard and I come back to a lot, which is that there is a difference between the type of copper extraction that might have been going on for local trade and local production of metal versus the level of bulk extraction that we saw in the late Bronze Age. And we believe that level of bulk copper extraction was a major driver in the formulation of the social complexity. And so without that driver, then you have to ask, is there something to replace that? And so far we haven't seen what that would be.
But I don't think that any one of us would disagree that that kind of copper trade had come to an end.
Yeah, and that's the point.
We don't disagree on
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
right?
yeah, right.
But would you say, if I
Yeah.
ask now, would you say that let's take an old ancient Papa? Would you say that that's a non-urban entity in the 11th, 10th century? Would you say that places like Kalebopos,
Yeah.
Gideon, or Enkomi moving towards Salamis were no longer urban entities?
Yeah, so I think the way I would answer that is in two ways. I think the evidence for any one of those specific settlements in terms of just how large they were and just how dense they were populated is an open question. But I would also say that there's an opportunity here, I think, to expand our definition of what urban might look like. So especially in the case of Paipafos, there's an opportunity to talk about a more dispersed settlement that nonetheless has the attributes of an urban environment. And that's something that I think is just, it needs more work.
It depends what we want to call urban at the end of the late Bronze Age or in the new era.
Yeah.
Because things are transforming.
Yeah, agreed.
The word for this kind of research is regionalism. Unless we work per region, we're not going to solve these issues. They are so diametrically different. I mean, look at the Kalavasos Valley and look at the area of Kalevopos of Kuria. And what do you do with Amathus? With a few thousands of early Iron Age tombs, with lots of goods in it. Yes, there's a problem with the export issue, that's for sure. But again, we need to look at things in a regional perspective.
Yeah, very much agreed. Very much agreed. So I think the model that,
If I may add,
yeah.
your maps are wrong.
What's wrong with it?
Completely wrong. I mean, talking about evidence
Which-
that is circumstantial.
So
if you start pointing them out again, I mean, what are you going to say about Idalium? That it disappeared?
no, I mean I think I
What
read.
are you going to say about Hydri and Lydra? I mean, do we really know what's going on in Lydra and Hydri so that we can
No,
make
wait,
them
yeah.
appear in the? I mean, that
Yeah. So
these are very dangerous maps. Be
no,
careful.
noted. Thank you. So just to comment on that, Bernard, for 1 sec. So I did mention that it's for me it's an open question about Idalian, but I was just rereading the publications on Idalian, and again it comes to just a few sherds here and there, and it's very hard for me.
Few shirts of what?
For the earliest Iron Age period. So unless I'm missing a citation, which you can help me with.
We are missing quite a few unpublished early Iron Age.
Yeah. So that's probably my problem there.
So
Yeah.
one of the issues, and that's why I return to regional studies, is that there is unpublished evidence we have to look into, and we really have to decide when we study these regions, what is the extent? I mean, even if it's arbitrary, we have to create some form of regional entities and work within them.
Yeah. I mean, you did that with your work. You created areas which you looked at for.
Could I just say, Maria, that these maps are not misleading. They're meant to paint a very general picture so that the audience can immediately see the differences between each period, and in particular, the differences between the late Cypriot 3A and 3B period and the Cypro-geometric 3 and Cypro-archaic 1 on the bottom right, which is unlabeled. They aren't meant to be, and they can't be, and you've just been discussing one reason why they can't be absolutely accurate. They are meant to paint a general picture. And for me, this is a picture that goes far beyond the importance of regionalism. It's trying to get at the larger picture of the political economy of the early Iron Age. So I'll leave you and Nathan to discuss the particulars, but this is not a misleading map. This is a map to give the audience an impression.
Bernard, I tried this exercise during my contribution to the Colstring Memorial Conference. I still have the maps. And in the end, I got worried.
Yeah.
Because I realized how much we were missing. But between the 12th century and the 11th, in fact, the change is minimal. It's happening already in the 12th, right? We're missing the sites already.
Yeah.
You can see that pretty well with Late Cypriot 3A
No, I'm
and
talking
3B.
about especially secondary sites that should not be coming in so suddenly afterwards. We don't know much about what's going on in the early Iron Age, especially in the early Iron Age, either in Tamasus, in Yitri.
Yeah, I should have mentioned, Maria, that the way that I put these maps. So I built the maps. Bernard gets a free pass. The way I put these together is I created the square, the blank square, versus the black diamond. And the blank square basically means there's published information that indicates that there might be something going on there, but I can't get confident that there's really a substantial settlement there with a substantial population. Whereas the black diamond means, hey, there's something here that we can.
I know you haven't talked with Anna Georgiadou yet, but there she is, and I'm sure you'll get a chance to analyze things, because if she has persuasively shown that we have these regional workshops going on, especially in the 11th, 10th century, you have quite a few things to discuss in terms of
I do look forward to reading your dissertation, Anna.
And of course there's a diametrically different destiny between what is going on in the West, for instance,
Yes,
and in
right.
the heart of Chile.
Yes. Agreed.
Also,
Thank you for doing
Gilboa is not all that negative about exchanges. Nor is
well, I mean, that's how I read what she was saying. So I mean, I took away from her arguments that there was a substantial drop off.
they're still using terms like the Cypro-Phoenician koine for the period.
Yes.
So there must be something.
Yes, indeed. I agree with that. Stylistically, a good
If I
conversation.
may comment on this,
Yeah.
if we consider pottery as a secondary
Yeah.
cargo that follows
Right.
the copper,
Yeah.
and if we consider that in the 11th and 10th century they don't need to bring Cypriot copper because they have tons of it from
Yeah.
Tainan and Timna,
Yeah.
that's why you have the drop off, because they don't bring the Cypriot copper to the east.
Yeah, and that's essentially what our thought is, you know. And what I find really interesting about when the pottery starts to show up again is it's different. You know, it's not closed vessels that maybe are being used to carry some kind of, you know, product. They're really open shapes, and they seem to have this cultural conversation going on stylistically that extends over, you know, 2 centuries. And it's a very deep conversation they're having between certain sites on Cyprus and certain sites on the Levantine coast. And that to me is really fascinating. There's something there going on.
But I think we all see that in the supergeometric era, before supergeometric 3, there's a greater investment in what goes into tombs. And later on, this starts moving
Yeah.
into sanctuaries.
Yes, right. Yeah.
So we do not disagree that there is a political development.
Yeah.
But it's not happening throughout the island at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not
Yeah.
as parallel or contemporary.
Yeah, and I would love, and maybe it's with you, Maria, to sit down and have a conversation about what's going on in the 11th century with the standardization of the pottery, because
There they all are.
yeah.
Yorgos.
You said something very important before. I think you said that we still need to understand the different phases of the in these centers that they stay into the Iron Age, there you can draw symbolisms and continuations in ideology at least. So, as Maria said, of course, there is political development, but then if you see the culture and the ritual, I think you see a lot of differences as long as we go to real urban centers.
Just that last, you see the continuity as long as you're looking at,
to Engomi, So there is a lot of continuation in
Right.
ideology, I think, with the later centers.
Right.
This is what I try to publish. You said to me I want to comment more about this.
Yeah.
How I see it is what I publish in the Journal of Greek Archaeology. I see a lot of continuation in terms of iconography and ritual from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age, if you go to the iconography.
Okay, thank you. I'll definitely follow up on that one. Yeah.
I saw your hand.
In the recent volume on inequality, in honor of Fernand's talk, there are a number of papers which they stress the importance of Hollywood. And I didn't see anything about the economy of the olive. You have to talk about pottery, on.
Yeah.
But I think the agricultural products are even more important, I could say.
Yeah, Bernie, do you want to?
Take into consideration
I agree, yeah.
We had 45 minutes up here, and we already felt that we were extending ourselves, hence the omission of Yorgos's metal objects. And whereas I don't disagree in principle with the significance of the agricultural component of the economy, I certainly don't believe it was more important than the copper export economy. But yes, you can be sure that the written version of these papers pays as much attention as we can to the agricultural side of the economy.
Well, and there will be
Yeah.
long and intense continuation
Yeah.
on all these topics.
Absolutely, and just to say again, thanks. Again, thank you for the warm welcome back to the island, and I appreciate you guys coming out and listening to the talk, and I really appreciate the feedback too. So just beat me up as much as you want. Thank you.